The C++ while loop is one of the basic control structures that all first semester programming students need to understand. I'm going to take you through it so you know what's going on. So the C++ while statement is one of the simplest loops we can write in C++. It is one of the fundamental control structures. That and the for loop, you need to know both of these if you're going to understand looping. Now, looping is also known as iteration or repetition. It just depends. Your textbook may describe it as such. Now, I'm using Visual Studio and I have created a console application. If you want to know how to get Visual Studio Community Edition, I do have a video on downloading and installing it, and I have a video on how to create a console application. Let's take a look at the while loop. So what I'm going to do in this program is my inputs are going to be the grades, and my output is going to be the average of all the grades. And I've done a little bit on my naming conventions here. Every variable starts with a 3-letter abbreviation telling me what it is. This is an integer variable that is going to keep track of the total number of grades, and we're going to start out at 0. This is going to be my input. This is what the user is going to type their grades into, and it is a float, so I put FLT on the beginning, and I'm using capitalization case for each word in my variable name. This is going to be my total. I've got to get my total of the grades if I'm going to get the average. So what you want to do with a while loop is start out by doing your first input, and we often call this the priming read, before we go into the loop. So what we're going to say here is please enter grade number blank, number of grades, and the user is going to enter -1 to say we're done. And then we do a cin and we get the grade in. Now the loop, here is the loop statement. You have to use the word while in lowercase, open parenthesis, and then you're going to have a relational Boolean expression. In other words, this is going to turn out to be true or false. So I'm saying if the input grade is not equal to -1, this will be true. So while this is true, it's going to do all the code between the open brace and the close brace. So the first thing is we will not have gotten in the loop if the user did not type a valid grade. If they type -1, it's going to exit the loop immediately. It's going to run the while loop 0 times. A while loop will run 0 or more times. It is possible to run 0, which leads to a possible bug in this program that I'm deliberately not handling. So once we get into the loop, I have to take the grade the user typed in and add it to my total. And as you can see, my total starts out at 0. Very important to start totals at 0. And then I need to keep track of the total number of grades I have, because to get the average, you've got to take the grand total of all the grades and divide it by the number of grades you have. Now, I've got to have something happen in this loop that's eventually going to make this condition become false. So at the bottom of my loop, I repeat my input. Please enter a grade -1 to exit, cin float in grade. This will get me out of the loop when the user types -1, and it will get me out of the loop immediately, which leads to why you do your priming read before you go into the loop, and you do your next input for the next time around at the bottom of the loop, because that simplifies our logic. And if I didn't do this read first right here, I would have to immediately have an if statement in here to make sure that the grade was not -1, because if they entered -1, I do not need to add that to the total, and I certainly don't need to add 1 to the number of grades. So I would be checking for the same condition twice. I'd be checking it here, and I'd be checking it here, and it'd be quite messy. So let me pause the video, and I'll change the code up and show you why you don't want to do it that way. So if I don't do my priming read before I go into the loop, the first thing I have to make sure I do is make sure that float in grade isn't -1, because if it happens to be -1, it's not even going to go into the loop at all. So then once I'm in the loop, I have to do my input, just like I did before, except now, if they entered -1, I have to avoid adding that grade to the total, because if you add -1 to the total, you're going to throw the total off, and avoid adding 1 plus plus, add 1 to int num grades. So now I'm checking for the condition every time I go around the loop, and I'm checking for the exact same condition again while I'm in the loop. Because remember, the way the while loop works, it checks the condition. If this condition is true, it runs all this code, and when it gets to the end of the while loop, it's going to jump back up and check the condition again. So this is less efficient and it's messier because I'm checking for the same thing twice. And the problem is, if we do the input at the top of the loop, we're not checking for exiting the loop until after we've gone through the body of the loop. Now I'm going to change the code back to the way we want it to be. I'm going to pause the video again and put it back and step through it. And through the magic of pausing the video and using the undo key, Control Z, gotta love it, I'm back to my original code. So here I'm doing my first input before I get into the loop. I'm immediately checking to see if they type -1. If we get into the loop, we know it's not a -1. We're going to add that grade to the total, add 1 to our counter, our integer counter that keeps track of the number of grades, and then the bottom of the loop, the last thing we do in the loop is ask for the next input. Now, once I get out of the loop, I'm going to take the total of all the grades, divide it by the number of grades input, which is int num grades, and that's going to be my average. And then I'm going to do a nice cout saying how many grades and what the average is. So let's just watch this run in the program run normally, and then I'll step through it with the debugger. So I'm starting the program by hitting the triangle up here, as you saw, and here is my console window. So let's enter 3 grades: 100, 90, and 80, and then I will type in -1. So it says the average of the 3 grades is 90, which is exactly right. 100, 90, and 80 is going to average out. Now, let's step through this with the debugger. I'm going to put a breakpoint right here on line 24 by clicking in the gray margin. That's going to pause my program when I hit this line of code. I'm going to hit the triangle to run my program and wait for it to pop up here. And come on. Here we go. Yes, that's a good compiler. So right now it is paused before it did this cout. So I'm going to come up here and do step over. It runs that line of code. I'm going to hit step over again. And now it is waiting to do the input. So let's put in that 100. Now, if we look at the value of float in grade, it's a 100. And my while condition says, while float in grade is not equal to -1, go into the loop. So I'm going to hit step over. It's now in the loop because that condition was true. It's going to add 100 to the total. It's going to add 1 to the number of grades. So now we've got 100 for the total. Total number of grades is 1. And then we're going to do our next input. So my next input is going to pop up and I'm going to type in 90. So now we're at the bottom of the loop because we just finished these 2 lines of code. If I say step over, it's going to go back up to the condition and say, is float in grade equal to -1? Float in grade is a 90, so that is not equal to -1, so that is a true statement. Add the 90 to the total, so now we have 190 and we have 2 grades, and then we do our next input. In my next input, I'll put in the 80. It's going to jump back up to the top of the loop and say, is 80 not equal to -1? That is a true statement. It will stay in the loop, add the 80, add the number of grades. So now we have a total of 270 and 3 grades. And this time, just like I did before, I will type in -1. So now when it goes back up to the top of the loop, this condition is going to become false. And that is going to break me out of the loop. And when it breaks out of the loop, it'll pick up on the next line of code after the loop, which is to calculate my average. So my average is 90, which is 270 divided by 3. That's why we kept track of the count, is just to get the average. And then I'll do my cout, and we can see my average. Now, a few quirks with this program. You'll see right here it says, please enter grade number 0. That kind of throws the user off a little bit because they're not used to thinking in terms of 0 as the first item. So we probably want to edit the program and make it start at 1 right here. But if we start at 1, then we're going to get to 4, and we don't have 4 grades. Or is that going to be a problem? Let's test it out. All right, so the first obvious way I can fix the please enter grade number 0 is to change my number of grades to 1 right here. So when it does this cout, it says please enter grade number 1, and then 2, then 3, then 4. But are we going to get the right answer if we do this? So I'll just run my program without the debugger. You can see right here there is no red circle on line 24. You click on it, it turns on the breakpoint. You click on it again, it turns it off. I'm going to run my program, and I'll put in the same set of data. So let's put in 100, 90, 80, -1. So now we've introduced a bug into our program. We have let our grade counter get all the way to 4 when we only entered 3 grades. And the reason that happened is because we started out at 1 instead of 0. So I can start out at 0 here, and there's a couple ways I can fix this. Probably the easiest way is just to change my prompt to say, please enter grade number int numgrades plus 1. So now, even though our number of grades is 0, the user will see a 1. So I can make that change in both of these places. And let's run the program again and see if everything is happy. So let's bring it back in. I'll say 100, 90, 80, -1 to exit the program. And now you see we're back to getting the correct answer. So you can see that there are some subtleties in programming, details we have to pay attention. There's no use confusing the user with a message that says, please enter grade number 0. But then again, if we start our grade out at 1, if I was to start my grade out at 1, here, let me change it back to how I have. So I've got it back to the original output of the number of grades, except I'm starting at 1. And I demonstrated that this code, we're going to go through, if we go through the loop 3 times, that's going to make this become 2, 3, and 4. It's going to be 1 too large. Well, another way I could fix that is right after I get out of the loop, since I know my number of grades is going to be too big, I could go minus minus, and this would also fix the problem. But I think that code is a little trickier. And the problem right here is, let's see, let's get my grades in. And then -1, so everything looks good. We've got 3 grades. We've got the right average. Everything looks good. Problem is right here is, to another programmer, this might be confusing. So here is where you'd want to add some documentation. Since num grades started at 1, need to subtract 1 after the loop. So you'd need to do some documentation. Anytime you do something weird that's unexplained, I recommend highly that you add some comments. Now, personally, I think the way I would do it is just modify my message. I would go back to what I had before. I'd get rid of this, and I would start my number of grades at 0 because I want that to be accurate at all times. And then right here on this message, I would say +1 with parentheses around it. So I'm printing out more than the number of grades. and I would do this just so it looks, the message looks good to the user, but int numGrades is always holding the correct value. Now remember, these yellow bars here are code I have not saved. I'm going to come up and hit Save All. So now all my changes have been saved. My program is working well, and let's just recap how the while loop works. While float in grade is not equal to -1. So as long as they haven't typed into -1, this condition will be true. And we're going to add that to the total, add 1 to the number of grades, and then at the bottom of the loop, I input my next value. You do your first input before you get into the loop, and that's commonly called the priming read. And then when you get at the bottom of the loop, you do your next input. So if they typed in a -1, here it will immediately exit the program and not add the -1 to the total and not go int num grades. But this is the format of a while loop. While a condition is true, do everything in the loop. And you have to make sure that something is happening in the loop so this condition will eventually change. Otherwise, you'll get an endless loop and your program will run forever unless you kill it with Task Manager or Control-C or something like that. But that is an introduction to the while loop. If you enjoyed this code and you want to see more examples like this, I would certainly appreciate it if you would like and subscribe. Take care.